teams, the Motley Crue,
Oh
and they're
wow.
little kids.
Yeah, yeah,
They'll have jerseys on, say Motley Crue on them.
yeah.
Just like, wow, that's pretty.
There's a version of the Vince Neil story that looks like a dream. Frontman of one of the biggest rock bands in history, sold out arenas, platinum records, a face on every magazine. But underneath the leather and the lights, there's another story entirely. One of wreckage, grief, and a man who kept colliding with the worst versions of himself. This is that story. Vince Neil was born Vincent Neil Wharton on February 8, 1961 in Hollywood, California. He grew up in Compton and later Glendora, and from an early age, music was the thing that made sense to him. He had a voice that could cut through a wall of Marshall stacks and still sound like it was talking directly to you. By the time he was a teenager, he knew exactly what he wanted to do with it. In 1981, he joined a band that was still figuring out what it wanted to be. Mötley Crüe was loud, dangerous, and completely committed to excess. With Vince on vocals, alongside Tommy Lee, Nikki Sixx, and Mick Mars, they began building something that would become one of the defining acts of an entire decade. Their early albums moved fast and loud. By the time Shout at the Devil dropped in 1983, the world was paying attention. And by Theater of Pain and Girls, 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 Mötley Crüe weren't just a band, they were a phenomenon. Vince Neil was the face of all of it. The bleached hair, the tan, the voice that sounded like California and chaos all at once. Teenage America put him on their walls. Radio stations couldn't stop playing him. But fame at that level has a way of removing guardrails, and for Vince Neil, those guardrails were already thin. December 8, 1984. That date sits in the middle of Vince Neil's life like a fault line. He and Nicholas Razzle Dingley, the drummer for the Finnish rock band Hanoi Rocks, had been drinking heavily at Neil's home in Redondo Beach. At some point, the two decided to make a beer run. Vince got behind the wheel of his Ford De Tomaso Pantera with a blood alcohol level later measured at .17, more than twice the legal limit at the time. Less than a mile from his house, he lost control of the car and collided head-on with an oncoming vehicle. Razzle Dingley was killed on impact. He was 24 years old. The two people in the other car, Lisa Hogan and Daniel Smithers, suffered serious injuries. Smithers sustained permanent brain damage. The case against Vince Neil was straightforward. The blood alcohol was documented, the outcome was undeniable. But what followed shocked people who expected the legal system to treat this with the severity it deserved. Neil pled no contest to vehicular manslaughter and was sentenced to 30 days in jail, of which he served only 15, along with 5 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and roughly $2.5 million in civil settlements. 30 days for a life. The families were devastated. The rock community was stunned, and Vince Neil walked back out into the world, back onto the stage, back into the spotlight, carrying something he would never fully put down. In interviews over the years, he's spoken about the accident with apparent remorse, acknowledging that he was responsible, that it was his fault, that he has to live with it. But acknowledgement and accountability are different things, and the sentence he received made it easy for the public, and perhaps for Neil himself, to move on faster than the weight of it warranted. Success continued regardless. The records kept selling, the tours kept selling out, but the personal chaos didn't slow down, it accelerated. His pattern of physical altercations is long and well documented. In 1988, he attacked a sound engineer named Ari Cohn backstage at a show, breaking his nose. That incident ended in a lawsuit and a settlement. In the early 1990s, there was the now famous confrontation at a party in Los Angeles, where Vince Neil punched actor Nicolas Cage in the face during a dispute. Cage has talked about the incident in interviews. It was absurd, public, and entirely on brand for what his life had become during that period. More seriously, he accumulated multiple allegations of domestic violence and battery over the years involving different women. These weren't rumors circulating on the fringes. Several led to legal proceedings. The pattern pointed toward something deeper than rock star recklessness. It pointed toward a man with serious, unresolved anger, a substance problem that shaped his behavior, and a social environment that consistently insulated him from full consequences. In 1991, Motley Crue fired Vince Neil. The reasons given at the time centered on his commitment, or lack of it, to the band, his weight, his drinking, his general unreliability. He went solo and had some commercial success, but the solo years never matched what the Crue had been. He rejoined the band in 1997, and they continued recording and touring, but the internal dynamics had shifted permanently. What also happened during those years, the thing that overshadows everything else in his personal life, was the death of his daughter. Skylar Lene Neal was born in 1991. She was Vince's daughter from his relationship with Charisse Rudell. By 1994, Skylar was diagnosed with retroperitoneal sarcoma, a rare form of abdominal cancer. She was 4 years old. Vince Neil, whatever his failures as a public figure and private person, has spoken consistently and painfully about this period. He was present. He was there. He watched his daughter fight a disease that gave her no realistic chance, and on August 15, 1995, Skylar died. She was 4 years old. The grief he has expressed in interviews over the decades reads as real and unperformed. He established the Skylar Neal Memorial Fund to raise money for children's cancer research and hospital care, an effort that has persisted long after the initial wave of public sympathy faded. Whatever else is true about Vince Neil, that loss marked him in a way that seems to exist entirely apart from the rock star narrative. It is simply a father who lost his child and never stopped carrying it. The financial dimension of his life tells its own story. Despite being a member of one of the highest-grossing rock bands in history, Vince Neil has filed for bankruptcy multiple times. The money came in enormous quantities and went out in ways that bankruptcy filings tend to document with uncomfortable specificity. Gambling debts, extravagant spending, legal settlements, lifestyle costs that don't scale down when income becomes irregular. Alcoholism has been a consistent thread throughout his adult life, by his own acknowledgement. He's checked into treatment, stepped away from it, relapsed. The cycle is familiar, not unique to rock musicians, but amplified by an environment where excess is not just tolerated, but celebrated, where the people around you have financial incentives to keep you functional rather than healthy, and where the audience expects a version of you that is permanently in 1987. In 1999, a private adult tape featuring Vince Neil was leaked without consent. In the years since, his public image has continued to be shaped by the accumulation of incidents, the DUI that killed a man, the violence, the financial collapses, the personal losses, the controversies that seem to find him even in quieter periods. What you're left with is a portrait that resists easy conclusions. He caused real, irreversible harm. Razzle Dingley's family lost a son and a brother and a friend because Vince Neil chose to get behind the wheel drunk, and a sentence of 15 days in jail is not justice by any reasonable measure. The people who bore the physical consequences of that crash, Daniel Smithers, who suffered permanent brain damage, were not offered any path back to who they were before December 8, 1984.
At the same time, Vince Neil is not a cartoon villain. He's a man who experienced extraordinary success and extraordinary grief, who carried a disease called alcoholism through an industry that treated it as a personality trait, and who has demonstrated, in the work he's done in Skylar's name at minimum, that something real and human exists underneath the persona. Both of those things can be true. The harm he caused is real. The grief he's carried is real. The legal system's failure to hold him appropriately accountable for a death he caused while drunk is real. And the complicated, unresolved nature of his legacy is exactly what happens when consequence and fame don't arrive in proportional amounts. Motley Crue's music still fills arenas. Vince Neil still tours. The voice is still there, even if the years have marked it. But somewhere in Redondo Beach, on December 8th of every year, a family marks an anniversary that Vince Neil created. And somewhere, a father who lost his little girl keeps writing checks to children's hospitals in her name. That's the story, all of it. Not the version that fits on a poster, and not the version that fits on a mugshot. The whole complicated, unresolved, very human mess of it.